Picture this. You're running on a treadmill that never slows down, chasing a version of happiness that always feels one step ahead. We fill our lives with productivity hacks, affirmations, curated goals, and the illusion of control. Yet behind all that effort often lies a quiet hum of anxiety, a sense that no matter how carefully we design our routines, peace keeps slipping through the cracks. We scroll through feeds full of smiling faces and perfect lives, but inside, something feels off, as if the more we chase happiness, the more fragile it becomes. What if resilience, real inner steadiness, isn't built by chasing our own joy at all? What if the secret sits hidden in a 19th century philosopher's journal, written after a breakdown so severe he questioned whether life itself had meaning? His name was John Stuart Mill, and the code he uncovered still speaks to our modern struggle. Mill discovered that happiness cannot be seized. It must emerge as a byproduct of purpose. He called this idea utilitarianism, a life guided not by self-interest, but by the quiet pursuit of the greatest good for the greatest number. Mill's revelation was radical then and remains so now. In a culture obsessed with self-optimization, he suggested that true contentment grows only when we stop orbiting around ourselves. He believed the path to stability begins when your life's gravity shifts from "what do I want" to "how can I contribute?" That single shift rewires everything. Suddenly, personal success becomes less about accumulation and more about alignment between your actions and the well-being of others. It's easy to dismiss this as old-world moralizing, yet modern psychology increasingly agrees. Studies on altruism and meaning show that people who connect their goals to service, however small, develop greater emotional resilience and lower anxiety. They bend without breaking. As Mill once noted in Spirit, happiness follows those who aim beyond it. It's not the finish line, it's the dust that rises behind purposeful motion. And that brings us to the man himself, the prodigy who turned his collapse into one of the most enduring blueprints for a resilient mind. John Stuart Mill wasn't born into an ordinary life. Raised in early 19th century London by his father, the philosopher James Mill, he was molded from childhood to become an intellectual reformer. By his teenage years, he had already mastered Greek, Latin, logic, and political economy. To the outside world, he seemed unstoppable, a human engine of progress destined to advance the new philosophy of utilitarianism. But beneath that disciplined brilliance was a young man under immense pressure. His identity was built entirely around purpose, yet that purpose belonged more to his father's vision than to his own heart. At 20 years old, that machinery finally broke. What had once driven him, the idea that life's meaning could be measured in the arithmetic of pleasure and pain, suddenly felt empty. One morning, he asked himself a haunting question. If every dream I've worked for came true, would I feel joy? The answer that echoed back was silence. That silence became a collapse. Mill slipped into a depression so deep he described moving through life as if by habit alone, the motions of meaning without the feeling of it. The moral math that once guided him now seemed cruelly mechanical. His mind, trained to quantify happiness, could no longer feel it. Yet from that darkness emerged the spark of his greatest insight. Mill realized that happiness, pursued directly, evaporates under scrutiny. The more you chase it, the further it retreats. Instead, he began to see happiness as something indirect, the shadow cast by a life devoted to higher purposes. As he later reflected, those who fix their attention on something larger than themselves, justice, learning, kindness, discover happiness along the way, almost by accident. That insight would reshape not only his recovery, but the entire philosophy of utilitarian ethics. Mill rebuilt his mind piece by piece. He started small, reading poetry, walking in nature, letting his emotions breathe after years of suppression. Through the verse of Wordsworth, he reawakened his ability to feel beauty again. This was not sentimentality, it was psychological repair. Poetry taught him that the human heart cannot thrive on logic alone. We need experiences that nourish the inner life, the higher pleasures as he later called them, the joys of understanding, empathy, and creativity. He began to see that a philosophy centered only on quantity of happiness was missing something essential: quality. The good life wasn't about maximizing sensation, but cultivating depth. A calm moment of truth could outweigh 1,000 fleeting thrills. From this rebirth came Mill's matured version of the greatest happiness principle. It was no longer a cold equation of pleasure versus pain, but a living ethic of empathy. An acknowledgement that every person's joy carries equal weight, including your own, but not privileging it. Here lies his true key to resilience. When your sense of purpose expands beyond self-interest, failure loses its sting. A setback becomes smaller in scale because your identity no longer ends at the edge of your own desires. You belong to something larger, the ongoing project of human well-being. That realization forged a paradoxical strength within Mill. By decentering himself, he became grounded. The self he once tried to perfect was finally at peace when it served something beyond itself. And that brings us to the next step in his transformation, the discovery that not all pleasures are equal, and that the kind of happiness we seek determines the stability of our lives. Imagine standing at a crossroads between two kinds of happiness. One path promises comfort, the quick satisfaction of pleasure and ease. The other offers fulfillment, slower, harder, but deeper. Mill spent years trapped on the first path, chasing outcomes that looked like happiness but left him hollow. His recovery forced him to ask, are all pleasures created equal? His mentor, Jeremy Bentham, had said yes. Happiness is happiness, whether it comes from a meal or a masterpiece. But Mill's experience taught him otherwise. There are pleasures that feed the body and pleasures that feed the soul. The first flicker and fade. The second build a foundation. Mill called them lower and higher pleasures, and his distinction became one of the most profound ideas in philosophy. Lower pleasures are the easy wins, the rush of a purchase, the hit of a notification, the comfort of distraction. They soothe us, but rarely strengthen us. Modern life offers them endlessly, an infinite buffet of quick dopamine. But these pleasures, as Mill understood, make us dependent. They train the mind to expect stimulation instead of satisfaction. When the stimulus stops, the emptiness returns. Higher pleasures, on the other hand, require effort, curiosity, patience, skill. They're the quiet joys of learning something difficult, creating something meaningful, or connecting deeply with someone. They're not always exciting, but they build emotional muscle. They turn life into a long-term investment rather than a series of short-term highs. Mill famously compared these two modes of living through a simple contrast. It's better, he said, to be a thoughtful human who wrestles with meaning than a creature content with ignorance. In other words, the depth of our struggle often mirrors the depth of our humanity. When you pursue higher pleasures, you choose growth over numbness. You accept discomfort as part of evolution. And modern neuroscience supports this. Activities that require sustained focus, reading, creating, problem-solving, acts of compassion, strengthen neural pathways associated with emotional regulation and long-term satisfaction. They don't just feel better, they build better brains. The very things that challenge us most are what anchor us deepest. This is the second key to utilitarian resilience. A life centered on higher pleasures cannot be easily shaken. When joy comes from learning, connection, and purpose, external chaos has less power. The storms of life may still rage, but your foundation rests on internal strength, not external circumstance. Mill's philosophy becomes a mirror for our time. It asks us to audit our pleasures, to notice how many of them merely distract us from ourselves and how many actually develop us. Because the truth is simple yet uncomfortable. Ease rarely shapes character. The higher path demands effort, but it gifts us meaning, and meaning is what endures when pleasure fades. That understanding would later find its greatest confirmation not in philosophy, but in science, as researchers began to uncover the biological proof behind Mill's century-old insight. Picture a lab in the modern era. A volunteer sits inside an fMRI scanner, a screen glowing in front of them. They press a button to donate money to a charity, and in that instant, the same regions of the brain light up as when tasting good food or hearing a loved one's voice. Science, in its quiet way, has confirmed what Mill intuited 2 centuries ago. Our minds are wired to find joy not in self-gratification, but in contribution. The greatest happiness principle isn't just a moral idea, it's a biological truth. This behavior has a name now: pro-social motivation. Helping, giving, mentoring, these aren't acts of self-denial. They are neurological design features that reward us for strengthening the collective. Evolution, it seems, favored those who found pleasure in empathy. And in that sense, John Stuart Mill wasn't just describing an ethical path, he was describing how the human brain sustains itself under pressure. Psychologists now talk about 2 main forms of happiness: hedonic and eudaimonic. Hedonic well-being is what Bentham championed, the pursuit of pleasure and comfort, the avoidance of pain. It's what fuels modern consumer culture. Yet studies consistently show that when this becomes our primary focus, happiness becomes fragile. The moment circumstances shift, the job changes, the relationship falters, the novelty wears off, our emotional state collapses with it. Eudaimonic well-being, on the other hand, aligns almost perfectly with Mill's idea of higher pleasure. It's the satisfaction that arises from purpose, mastery, and connection, from living in harmony with one's values. This kind of happiness doesn't spike and crash, it stabilizes. People who pursue meaning over mere pleasure report greater life satisfaction, lower depression, and stronger immune function. Their happiness doesn't depend on what happens to them, it grows from what happens through them. The convergence between Mill's 19th century ethics and 21st century psychology is astonishing. Purpose-driven individuals, whether nurses, teachers, artists, or parents, show measurable increases in brain coherence, resilience, and longevity. Studies from institutions like Stanford and Harvard have found that even brief acts of kindness can lower cortisol, the stress hormone, while sustained altruistic habits increase serotonin and dopamine, the body's natural stabilizers. This isn't mysticism, it's measurable. When we act with compassion, the brain rewards us with calm and connection. When we live only for ourselves, it punishes us with restlessness and isolation. The science has caught up with the philosophy. Service isn't self-sacrifice, it's self-preservation. Mill had no way of knowing how accurate his insight would become. He didn't have brain scanners or data sets, only his lived experience of despair and renewal. Yet his message now carries empirical weight. The pursuit of meaning and contribution rewires the brain for endurance. We can see it in imaging studies, in hormonal shifts, in the faces of people who've turned suffering into service. Resilience in this light is not a trait, but a byproduct. It grows when our actions reflect our deepest values. It's not about hardening yourself against life's chaos, but harmonizing with it, choosing purpose over panic, contribution over control. And this brings us to the practical part of Mill's wisdom, the 5 habits that translate his philosophy into daily life, where ethics becomes resilience and thought becomes strength. Mill's wisdom only matters if it can be lived. He never wanted philosophy to stay trapped in books. He saw it as a guide for endurance, for building lives that remain steady through uncertainty. His insights distill into 5 timeless habits, pillars that anyone can practice. The first pillar is simplicity as power. In a world that confuses busyness for purpose, simplicity becomes an act of rebellion. Mill believed that clarity of mind begins with subtraction, removing the noise that numbs thought. Our modern equivalent? Curate your environment the way a philosopher curates ideas. Ask, does this habit, this subscription, this distraction serve my deeper well-being or drain it? The simplest way to reclaim your strength is not to add more, but to remove what weakens you. Simplicity is not absence, it's precision. When your life is uncluttered, your attention becomes powerful. Purpose has room to breathe. The second pillar is solitude and mental clarity. Mill often retreated into long walks through the countryside, where his thoughts could wander without expectation. Solitude for him was not escape, it was maintenance. Today, we fear being alone because silence exposes us to ourselves. Yet that exposure is exactly what we need. Neuroscience shows that during quiet reflection, the brain's default mode network activates, the system that connects memory, emotion, and self-understanding. Make solitude a ritual, not a rarity. 10 minutes without a screen, a walk without headphones, a few pages of journaling to trace the patterns of your mind. Solitude is where the noise of the world fades and the voice of reason returns. It's where resilience is quietly rehearsed. The third pillar is discipline and self-governance. Mill believed freedom meant self-control, not indulgence. To be ruled by every impulse is to live in chains. Discipline, in utilitarian terms, is not punishment. It's stewardship of your limited time and energy. It's the conscious trade of a smaller comfort for a greater good. Every choice is a vote for the person you're becoming. Do you reach for the easy scroll or the meaningful page? Do you avoid the conversation or lean into honesty? Each small act of governance strengthens your internal compass. Discipline is the muscle that turns philosophy into practice. The more you train it, the less you need to rely on willpower. It becomes your nature. The fourth pillar is purpose through mindful action. Mill's greatest happiness principle wasn't meant for grand theories alone, it was a compass for everyday life. You don't need to reform the world to live with purpose. You just need to connect what you do with who it helps. A parent guiding a child, an employee mentoring a colleague, a friend listening without judgment, these are utilitarian acts in motion. They elevate the common good one moment at a time. Each choice to help, teach, or understand is a micro-revolution against apathy. When you act mindfully for others, your identity becomes porous, less self-contained, more part of something enduring. Purpose is not an external trophy, It's the quiet knowledge that your actions add weight to the good side of the scale. The fifth pillar is protecting your peace. Mill wrote often about the limits of empathy, that to serve the world effectively, you must not drown in it. In an age of information overload, protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's strategic compassion. Emotional energy is finite. When you give it recklessly, you burn out. Set digital boundaries. Choose which battles you engage in and why. Learn to close the mental tabs that keep you running in the background. True resilience isn't permanent exposure, it's selective engagement. When you protect your calm, you preserve the clarity to act with wisdom, not reactivity. And when these 5 pillars work together, simplicity, solitude, discipline, purpose, and peace, they form the architecture of a life that bends without breaking. That leads us to Mill's closing paradox, the secret that ties his entire journey together. To find lasting happiness, you must first let go of the need to find it. Picture the arc of Mill's life, from a young prodigy driven by logic to a man humbled by despair, to a thinker reborn through compassion and clarity. His story mirrors our own journey through ambition, collapse, and renewal. He discovered that resilience doesn't come from hardening yourself against pain, but from expanding your sense of purpose beyond the borders of self. That's the paradox at the center of his philosophy. The more you chase happiness, the faster it runs. But when you aim instead at meaning, at helping, creating, serving, happiness follows quietly, like a shadow cast by purpose. Mill's lesson is as relevant now as ever. A resilient mind is not the one that avoids struggle, but the one that finds meaning within it. Every act of kindness, every disciplined choice, every moment of reflection adds a thread to the fabric of strength that holds us steady when life wavers. So as you step back into your day, carry this question with you. What small action today will increase not just my happiness, but the happiness of others? Because that question, lived daily, is the heartbeat of resilience. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who's searching for clarity, and subscribe. We're building a community of calm strength, one mindset at a time. And remember, peace is not the absence of challenge, but the alignment of purpose within it. The unshakable life isn't built in comfort, it's built in contribution.